Hi, everybody, and welcome to this exclusive masterclass presented by Mirus Australia on the target operating model for funding sustainability in aged care. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners, custodians of the country throughout Australia and their connections to the land, sea, and community, and we pay our respects to the elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people today. For those of you who do collect professional development points, this is 1 hour of training, so please capture that 1 point if you are trying to make up your target. We have a chat running. We have people monitoring that chat. Please ask your questions there. We have people there to answer your questions. So throughout the training, any questions you've got, please ask them in the chat and we will address them as much as we can. And if we get some good questions, we'll try to bring a couple up at the end. What we're going to discuss today around the operating model is it's not a webinar. This is not a point of view. This is training. This is a masterclass. So we had a fantastic opportunity recently with a client who came to us and said, "I've got a problem, a really blank sheet of paper. I want you to tell me how to do it." So we did, and we've had a great engagement there, helping them transition from ACFI to AN-ACC. And we want to present that to you. Obviously, we're not going, this is a 3-month process. It doesn't take that long to do it, but it takes that long to kind of bed it in. But we're going to try and in an hour, just tell you this is how you can do it. Now, there's probably a few different ways to do it well. There's probably 1,000 ways to do it wrong. So we're just trying to remove those 1,000. And if you're not sure how to do it properly or well, you can do it the way that we're going to tell you how to do it today. If you're doing it slightly different to that, but it's working for you, that's great too. But this is going to be 1 hour of telling you how to do it. And that's why it's a masterclass. This is training. We're going to tell you how to do it. And hopefully you'll all get something out of that. So we've got some survey findings. We polled you on the way in. We want to show you that as context. Then our data scientist, Tyler Fisher, is going to give you some data to show you how AN-ACC and ACFI are different and why that's important. Then I'm going to take you through the guts of the training, which is around the scenario and the strategy to set up how these problems present themselves and then how to analyze them and fix them. And then hopefully we'll get some Q&A at the end. So firstly, the poll. We polled everybody. We asked them 4 questions. The first one was, our current AN-ACC care minute strategy and process is efficient and is working well. Now, it's reassuring to see that 56% of people said that they agree and strongly agree that their strategy and process is efficient and working well. But it's still a little bit alarming to see that over 43% of people either are not sure or they disagree or strongly disagree. And that's after almost 2 years of AN-ACC. Then ask them, we have the right resources in place to manage end-to-end funding and the care minute processes. And again, 59%, nearly 60% agree or strongly agree that they do, but still well over 40% don't or are not sure that they do. We have daily transparency of our care minute compliance and future targets during the quarter. So not we can do our QFR reporting at the end of the quarter, but we actually have some transparency of how we're going and how we're moving towards our future targets during the quarter. So again, it's really positive that 56% say they do, but still concerning that almost half don't or aren't sure. And probably even more important that a much larger proportion of people, 14%, 15% disagree or strongly disagree. And similarly, we have proper applications in place to manage our data safely every step of this AN-ACC and care minute process. So no manual processes. Manual processes include spreadsheets. So no manual processes. We have a proper application to manage data safely. Again, bigger, 19, nearly 20%. Said they disagree or strongly disagree, and 34% are not sure, which for our polls tell us that people, it's not, I don't know the answer, it's I'm uncertain. I'm certain about whether I do or I don't, so I'm still waiting to find out. So that's over 50%. So systems is a problem. So let's get you bedded into the data. Let's have a look at some data as a foundation for our conversation. And I'm going to hand over to Tyler Fisher, our data scientist, to take you through some of the data.
Thanks, Andrew. So when I was putting these slides together and thinking about how to set the scene for a master class on AN-ACC, I knew that I wanted to start at the beginning, and that meant examining how AN-ACC was different to ACFI. So I revisited a lot of the thinking we did following the May 2021 budget announcement, and that was, over 3 years ago now. And we could see that linking a defined number of care minutes to each classification as a minimum amount of care to be delivered would drastically change the operations of residential aged care across the entire business. Many providers that we spoke to back then, they thought we were doing entirely too much speculation. Although some providers were on the same page as us and they prepared their organizations for really significant change. And the facts haven't changed. We weren't speculating about AN-ACC or its implications to business operations or the need for change management. The only thing we couldn't know was, and we still don't know, is how problematic is it for any given provider to be non-compliant? And how worrisome is it for any given provider to operate at a loss? Those are questions each organization has to answer for themselves. Our assumption, the foundation of our thinking, begins with the position that non-compliance is a problem, and financial deficits are a worry. I would also argue that these elements are largely opposing forces. And that really is the crux of difference between ACFI and AN-ACC. ACFI allowed for the provision of care to not be directly linked to care revenue. Providers were able to continually increase care subsidy with no implication to the underlying cost base. And AN-ACC changed that, increasing the claim profile, raising subsidy, increases the compliance requirement for care minutes, and that's cost. It was clear that balancing the cost of the clinical roster with subsidy revenue would be a business requirement, and not just quarter on quarter, but roster period to roster period, and really, day to day. The target is so small, you need to be anticipating resident movements and forecasting resident reassessments in order to maintain that balance. And on the next slide, we'll look at the current industry distribution of care minute performance in terms of their percentage of requirement met. So we can see where they land in this scatter. Each dot is a service in the industry and how much of their RN target they met and how much of their total time they met. And it's hard to sort of calculate the proportions here, but over half the industry is not compliant with their care minute requirement. And just under half the industry is recognizing a financial deficit. If we look at in terms of meeting both 100% of your RN time and 100% of your total time, it's closer to 2/3 of the industry that are not meeting those proportions of their care minute requirements. The good news is that over the past 2 years, this outlook has improved. So slowly but surely, the industry is shifting towards compliance, and we also see better outcomes in terms of financial sustainability. And I like this visualization as an aid to this concept of efficient balance or finding surplus within compliance, but it's really not accurate. The next slide is closer to reality in terms of scale. The reality is that very few providers are currently realizing a surplus and meeting care minute requirements. And that target is small. You want to be over 100% of your care minute time requirement met, but not extremely far over it, because that's you're overspending and going into that deficit. The margins are very fine. Overspending on the roster or failing to put enough hours in are both easy to do with just normal resident turnover. If your roster is ideally aligned to your care minute requirement, a slight drop in occupancy can send you into deficit. If your claims are closely matched to your care time, reassessing residents higher can push you into non-compliance. So what can we do to manage this? How can we take control of our claiming and rostering to achieve sustainable compliance? The next slide is the first lever. It's the fully utilized roster. Whether you're able to draw on a casual pool or you have a real sweetheart rate with an agency, or more likely you have neither of those things. This fully utilized roster can take on different strategies, but the underlying concept remains the same in that we have to form rosters and publish them based on the information that we have today for the shifts that will be on the floor 6 to 8 weeks from now. If we're going to be really successful in aligning our roster spend to the care that is required and the subsidy to fund it, then there has to be visibility of where our residents can move to. So where can they be reassessed to, and our capacity to use claim adjustments to offset other resident movements and roster challenges like sick leave, maternity leave, resignations, onboarding, training, shifts. All of these are constant complications to effectively managing this. And the next slide is the other side of that equation, which is your claim profile analysis, and more specifically, resident forecasting. Who can move higher or lower? Yeah, you might want to identify residents that are re-abled. Someone moves in with a broken hip, and they're highly assisted in their mobility, and they improve in that mobility. Whatever it is, there are avenues for residents to be reassessed to a lower classification if a scenario unfolds where that is effective for your business. And that's the whole point, is that we need to have an understanding of what's possible with these residents if we're to request a reassessment for them. And we also need to know, how accurate are we at predicting those outcomes? Providers who are successful in this have spent the past 2 years working through their shadow assessment backlog, getting funding to a level that matches the actual acuity of their residents. And they now seek a relatively stable claim profile. Subsidy income and care minute requirements, all of that as a stable target makes this whole analysis a lot simpler. But this actually still means monitoring changes in residents and the result of new classifications and identifying which reassessments are best utilized for offsetting the impact of admissions and departures. Typically, as higher acuity residents are departing, they're replaced with lower acuity admissions, and that requires us to identify resident uplifts to maintain consistency. Of course, this is not always the case, as resident movements are unpredictable, and individual care needs are changing in really unpredictable ways as well. So this is really why it has to be monitored daily and managed in a way that accounts for any number of possible scenarios that require action to some degree in really any direction to achieve the optimal business outcome. So I'll just wrap up here and note that really felt kind of like a trip down memory lane for me, but hopefully provided a good basis for the next segment. So I'll just hand it back to you, Andrew.
Yeah, thanks, Tyler. I think it's important to realize that the AN-ACC model coming out of the RUC study from Wollongong University was built differently to ACFI, and it isn't offering a huge amount of margin. It needs to be run efficiently, and we'll talk about that a lot more. So let's get to it. This is the client example that we started with. So it's a true story. We've run the project over the last few months. What we loved about this client was they came to us and they said, we don't exactly know how to do it right, but we know we're doing it wrong. So we just want to give you a blank sheet of paper and we want you to tell us how to do it right, which we love, right? So this is a perfect opportunity to go in and help them as much as possible. And so they were very open to everything we had to say. And so what we want to do is present that to you in this masterclass, because it was a very successful transition and a very successful resetting of the entire process. So they felt that their team, their funding team, was still stuck in that ACFI approach, and they were maximizing funding, and it was actually putting pressure. And we see this a lot in the industry. It was putting pressure on the rostering, it was putting pressure on the recruitment process, and it was pushing up agency costs. Now, agency costs across the industry are epidemic. In our information that we've been gathering across, we work with hundreds of providers. We estimate that the agency cost per facility is around 250 to maybe 350 or $500,000 a year per site. So, and we know a three or four bed four facility site that's spending $1 million and $1.2 million a year, and another site that's one site that's spending $300,000 a year. So this whole mentality of and this is not about not being able to find staff. This is about chasing funding and then having to chase compliance by bumping up your rosters and your care minutes and not being able to do that. And agencies are proliferating across Australia. So they wanted to transition to the new AN-ACC operating model, and they wanted us to help them do that. Perfect scenario. So what did we do? How did we start? The first thing we had to do is what we've just tried to start doing with Tyler there, is we actually needed to help the management and the stakeholders at all levels in the sites and in the central teams actually really understand the AN-ACC model and why it was different, how it worked different to ACFI. Now it's a little bit surprising after a couple of years that information is still not really well understood. But the fact is that AN-ACC works differently. It works in a specific way, and you need to therefore manage it in a specific way. There is no up, 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 as Tyler was saying, without consequences to care minutes. If you want to chase revenue, you better be able to find the staff. So if you can find the staff, as one of our clients in Melbourne, they said, we can have no problem finding staff. So we can push up revenue and we can find the staff. That's fine. Great. It doesn't matter where that balance is. It doesn't matter whether it's high revenue and high care minutes or low revenue and low care minutes. The point I want to make very, very strongly is we are talking about how to make the funding model work in practice. We are not talking about the model of care and quality. That is an absolute given. How you have your model of care and how you deliver quality and how you manage your residents' care is a given. We are talking about how you get the subsidy that you are entitled to through the AN-ACC mechanism, and it doesn't work the same as ACFI. Just want to make that really, really clear. If you are pushing your revenue up still and you can't find that staff in a normal roster, efficient roster way, then it's a complete false economy. You are just paying an outrageous amount of money to fill care minutes for revenue, and you are losing margin, and that eventually, when full compliance is achieved, will cost you dearly. So strategy. One of the first things you have to do before you implement the operating model is try to understand what kind of organization you are. So where do you want your care minutes to be? Where do you want your strategy and your compliance to be? Some organizations want to be more than 3 stars. They want to be 4 stars for competitive reasons, for brand reasons, whatever it is. Where do you want to be? You need to understand how you want your strategy to be set. We're just about, like we just showed you at the beginning, or Tyler said, almost 50% of businesses are not compliant with 200 minutes, and 215 minutes is literally weeks away. So it's really important that it's very important that you understand where you want them to be. If you can run the risk of not being compliant, and lots of clients aren't, then you're managing that, you're accepting that as a certain risk. But we're certainly advocating for full compliance, and you need to understand whether you're going to be compliant, more compliant, if there's any reason for you or that you want to do that. Once you've set that strategy, and this also includes how you structure your business and the roles you have in the business, I'll talk about in a minute. After you've set that strategy, you need to analyze what you're going to do according to this construct: the people, the process, and the systems. This is just one way to explain to you and to break down how to think about the decisions that you're going to make as you implement this operating model. So firstly, people. We need to understand who is involved in AN-ACC. So ACFI was a model that would run in silos. You could have one funding team working with the clinicians to identify potential uplifts, and then you had the rostering team setting rosters based on quality and based on managing cost. And then you had the admissions team trying to drive occupancy, and those three teams would rarely need to talk to each other. What ended up happening with that is that you would implement all of those individual strategies, and how you did would all come out in the wash in the finance results in the P&L six weeks later. And it's only then that the finance team and the leadership would actually know whether all of those three functions were doing a good job or not. The good news is AN-ACC not only requires those three functions to be a lot more connected, but in connecting their information and their decision making, the predictability of that outcome 6 weeks later becomes a lot greater. So if you are managing the good news is if you're managing AN-ACC properly and you've got funding and rosters and admissions connected in a way that gives everybody transparency, if you are controlling those decisions, then your funding outcomes, and therefore for your largest amount of funding and your largest amount of cost, your P&L outcomes become more predictable. So what are some of the decisions that you need to make? How are you doing your funding, especially if you've got more sites and you've got 1, 2, 3, 5, 10, 20 people doing funding, however big your organization is, how much of that work is going to be centralized and how much of that work is going to be decentralized? The same goes for rostering and the same goes for admissions. So that is a big part of implementing the operating model, because where people are and where people are doing different roles affects how you bring them together and how you create the transparency and how you make the decision-making processes. So we need to understand, first of all, where do you want to put people? In this client's example, they wanted to have a very small centralized team and they wanted to push responsibility back to the sites. Some organizations want sites to be accountable for those decisions, so they have accountability for performance and for financial outcomes. Some organizations want to centralize that a lot so that they create economies of scale, or they can create more control in a centralized way. But then sometimes that makes engagement at the sites more difficult. It doesn't really matter which you choose. The model can work either way, or any hybrid in between. How do you want to involve site-based clinical staff in the process? AN-ACC to some extent is still a clinical-based process, far less than ACFI. So the actual intervention that you need, we run a remote process where we can remote into your clinical system and review enough information to adequately assess and predict AN-ACC. So this reliance on a heavy reliance on clinicians on the sites is overdone, I think, in my opinion. Especially when the AMOs come in and do the reviews. They've got an algorithm that they run. They've never seen the resident before. There's quite a lot of variation in the way that they talk to staff, look at the resident and look at information, talk to families. So there's not such a heavy reliance on the clinical side of it. And a lot of clients, certainly in our observation, are still following those ACFI kind of processes where they get the clinical teams heavily involved in looking at AN-ACC uplifts, reviewing AN-ACC uplifts, making sure that they're perfect before they do anything about reclassifications. It's a much more mathematical model than that, but the clinicians on the floor do have input, do see changes in real time, and do need to be involved. But how are you going to involve those site-based clinical staff in the process? How much of that work is going to be done by your funding manager, a funding team? Some of the funding teams we're seeing now are becoming are being filled by RNs. Some of them have always been nurses. Remember that in many cases, care minutes technically are not cannot be claimed for funding processes. So funding processes are not claimable as care minutes. But if you're a little bit creative about the roles that those people are doing, and if they're doing more quality or they're doing more clinical review or clinical assessment and clinical admin, then they can be claimed. So there is a strategy to look at the roles that different people are doing and how those models or roles are interacting. But from a people point of view, you need to know how those roles are going to be set and what those people are going to be doing. Like I said, it doesn't matter. You've already got existing people or existing people roles. It doesn't matter who's doing what. There's if you want to start with a blank piece of paper like this organization did, sure, we can provide advice on an optimum way of running that. But if you've got existing people in existing roles, then as long as you understand exactly who's doing what, that's a great starting point to then start embedding the process. Generally, like I've said there with multi-sites, there's at least some centralized funding, people coordinating those AN-ACC decisions and that information. This is a more analytical process. Somebody needs to be looking at the information at a summary level and helping to make consistent decisions about the data and how to keep the AN-ACC funding in balance. So that's people. Make your people decisions about the roles that different people are doing, and just make sure you understand what they are and that they're set. Then we go into the process. The process is really about information, and this is really one of the big changes with ACFI over AN-ACC, is that the information before, like I said before, was siloed. It didn't need to flow. Now more than ever, the information needs a certain level, needs to be shared, and it needs to be transparent, and it needs to be accurate, and it needs to be safe. So this critical information that needs to be created, needs to be used, and needs to be shared by these different roles. And so that is the most important part of the process. Obviously, the clinical, the assessment information, the roster will tell you how many care minutes are being produced. It will tell you so that's a supply bit of information. The AN-ACC classifications will tell you not only what your care minute requirement is now, what your classifications and funding level is now, but should also be able to tell you what is the potential in your cohort of residents to change those classifications. So forecasting is important. You really need to know how to change, if you want to, all of the residents in your cohort. You will have residents that can go up. You have residents that will only stay the same, and you'll have residents, as Tyler mentioned earlier, that will be able to go down. But the ability to know what those classifications are now and what those classifications could potentially go to is very important information to have accurate all the time. You're not going to trigger all of that information all the time. So that information doesn't need to be 100% accurate all the time, but it needs to be being refreshed all the time so that you have a pretty accurate picture all the time of where you are now and where you could move to. And admissions is the same. You need some transparency of who's coming in, when, and what their classifications are, and the people going out of the facility. Who's going out when, and predicted maybe when, and it's hard to know that sometimes. But you need to be able to collect that information in a summary way so that you can have a good picture of how AN-ACC is potentially changing at any given moment. And when I say at any given moment, we operated on a fortnightly basis, the same as the roster. So on a fortnightly basis, and I'll come to operating with them, fortnightly basis, understanding how this information is changing. So, but the inputs of that could be being added all the time. So breaking down silence is new and important. So making sure that these people are in different roles, in admissions roles, in rostering roles, in funding roles, are talking to each other. And the best way to get them talking to each other is get them looking at the same information, sharing one secure, consistent source of truth. So everyone's looking at the same information. So back to what I said earlier, one of the first things we had to do with our approach is to educate everybody on how the models were different and why this information was important. So we did a lot of ongoing training in this 3-month process to make sure people understood what we were looking at and why it was important, and breaking down those silos by getting everybody sitting together and talking to each other and looking at the same information and acknowledging that this information was accurate. And certainly for multi-facilities, even getting those different facilities to be looking at each other's facilities so they could see how their information and other people's information was different and really get to understand what that information means. Then implementing the operating rhythm becomes important. In the first instance, it's about meetings. It's actually about a meeting. It's actually about bringing together the sites and the rostering and the admissions and the funding people and in management into one room and on a regular basis every couple of weeks to say, here is the information. This is what it looks like. Does it look right to you? Yes, it's right. And making sure that every 2 weeks, everybody was looking at the information that was and what needed to happen and what needed to change and what needed to be adjusted, and everybody understood what it was. In between those fortnightly meetings, at least in the first month or two, we had individual site meetings and individual admissions, rostering, and funding meetings to make sure that the individual roles or the individual sites came up to speed with how that information was working, so that when we came back to the fortnightly group meeting, everybody was on the same page, all the questions had been asked, and everybody could agree that what they were looking at made sense. After a while, these fortnightly meetings might not be required. It sounds like a lot to put fortnightly meetings in place, but you're probably doing something similar to that anyway. But it is a great way to break down silos and bring people together to look at the same information and make good decisions. In time, with the right system and with the right training and the right people, that meeting may not be required, because everybody is looking at the same information and they know what they're looking at. They know what decisions are being made and they know why. But if you want to create the rhythm and the operating rhythm in the first place, you create a meeting that's designed to do this. So the information flows in, the action flows out, and then that becomes the focus of the organization, so that they know what they're doing. This part of the organization, obviously the focus of the organization is caring for residents. So that takes us to a second part of the process, which is around care minutes. So in the process, analysing the funding was one thing, but then analysing the rosters and particularly the care minutes was a really important component. AN-ACC has two really important components: the funding part and the classifications, which are driving demand, what is the care minutes that are required, and then the rostering part, which is the care minutes supplied, what is the care minutes that are actually being delivered, and making sure those two things match. I'm just going to hand over to my colleague Chris here, who's going to talk a little bit about the process that he ran with this particular client and what was important about understanding care minutes through the rosters. Chris?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. So the first priority with this client was to ensure that all direct care was accurately accounted for and aligning with the most recent department guidelines. As you mentioned earlier, there were some changes late last year now where those funding activities couldn't be counted, and little things like that continue to change within the guidelines, which we need to be up to date with. So this step involved verifying their current care minute policy and then using that data to provide a reliable benchmark for staffing levels. So now that we know all direct care is being counted, we then moved on into the next step, which is focusing on maximising the use of contracted hours before turning to agency staff and overtime. So in this process, we found that some contracted shifts were not fully filled, and there was certain hours throughout a roster period that were being filled by agency staff when they could have been filled by these contracted staff. Fully utilising these staff gave us a strong foundation for where our rosters currently sit and really help with the next steps and really control this critical cost centre that's so important to balancing our funding with our care minute costs. So with the groundwork established, it became vital to ensure that both the rostering teams and the funding teams now had access to this information once the rosters had been worked. This transparency enabled informed decision-making for those teams. So it would help our AN-ACC teams now to know if we can move residents up or down, and we'll show you a bit more of that in the system. And then it helped rostering teams know if we're currently well above our care minutes, do we need to fill this shift next week if it's safe to do so, especially if we're going to have to fill it with agency or expensive overtime costs. So in summary, the faster access to that accurate care minute information really helped the teams to optimise their operations. And then as we'll go through a bit further, how that's helped maintain compliance while improving resource management for the facilities.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And really, I remember too, in this part of the process, this was a really important part because first of all, the information was quite fragmented. So there was the rosters, of course, but then there were different definitions about lifestyle and other interpretations, and some of that information in agency. So that wasn't, so there was definitely a degree of accumulating this information. And I remember it took, I don't know, 2, 3, 4 iterations of the information before everyone agreed that this information was complete and was accurate, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right. It was a long process, but one you need to get right at the start before you go too far into the process.
That's right, because if you're trying to get the balance between the care minutes supplied and the care minute demand, you need to make sure that, like you've said in the first point there, you've accounted for all your care minutes. We also do a lot of work, and as it says, a care minute policy there, with really helping people understand the rules. And the way that we do it is it's not interpreting the guidelines document. That's very clear. Everyone can read it. It's not that hard to understand. The guidelines are very broad though, and there's a lot of interpretation. But what we've done over a long period of time is accumulated all of the data from all the people that we've spoken to and we've worked with, and we've created a benchmark. So what that enables is for you to look at all these different roles and figure out whether the percentages that you're claiming fit within norms. So fit within what's acceptable in the industry. And that's not to any protection explicitly, but it means that when you do have your care time audits, and you will, because the intention is that 100% of providers have a care time audit, and they are exhaustive and they are painful. And we know from discussing with the department, as we do on a regular basis, that is not to intended to ping you guys. It's actually intended to make sure that the accuracy of the data across the industry is good, so that the assumptions they're making about policy is based on accurate data. And they are finding a significant amount of that information is not accurate. And so we're helping a lot of people in that process. But this is a very important part of the process. And it was a difficult part of the process, because in this part, depending on your rostering platform, depending on how you're accounting, depending on how you're doing your QFRs within a quarter, this information is not easily attainable, and took a little bit of pulling it together to create a complete picture. So it's something to be warned about. But thanks for that, Chris. Now we're going to go on to the third section now, which is systems. Now, systems is really important for us. We've built a system for AN-ACC. We built it from scratch. We just won an award from Inside Aging for our system. We've built it with a bunch of clients. And so this is industry built, and it's the only AN-ACC management system there is. There is a spreadsheet's not a system. A BI platform's not a system. It will give you information, but won't help you manage AN-ACC. So however you're doing it now, there is an alternative, and that's an AN-ACC management system. Now, we implemented this system with this provider. And what we wanted to do now, rather than just show you the system, is talk to you about how that system was implemented, and how this provider adopted it, and what were some of the things that we learned about that. But the point of the system is this: two things. The system is not going to do the job for you, in the sense that this transition needs to be managed and planned, and it's the people who are doing the work. The system is going to help you sustain the process. And the system, we had a fantastic quote from a client yesterday that said, "The system is the only way that I can keep my team accountable. It's the only way that I know that people have done what they're supposed to have done." And when somebody says to them, "Oh yeah, I've looked at that resident, and this is what's happening," they can say to them, "It's not in the system. It doesn't exist." So that was a great quote and a great example from a really good user of our system. But what we wanted to do as part of this is talk to you about how the system was adopted, or how the system helped this particular client to reach their potential. So the first question, Chris, is since you did this work with them, the importance of controlling the process and the people with the system. So what initially, when we sort of introduced the system to help them, what was sort of the information people struggled with initially, or thought about initially, or what were the questions that they asked in the beginning?
Yeah, Andrew, one of the main things they asked, which goes back to Tyler's point before, and we could see once we implemented the system, where do all my residents currently sit if they were to be reassessed today? And that question came up after we could see that a significant proportion of these residents hadn't been reassessed in the last 12 months. even some, as you mentioned before, dating back to the shadow assessment period. So from there, we can take them into the system to show how we put this data in there for them. So within the system, to assist with this process as well, our clinical team, as Andrew mentioned before, go into the system and assess each resident based on the data in the CMS system, similar to how an AMO would when they come out to a facility. This data is then stored securely in Mirus Metrics. And as you can see in the middle column, we have where the resident is actually sitting today. And then to the right of that, we have the forecasted AN-ACC class. And this is where we believe the resident could move to. Further along is then the change. So what is the change to our subsidy, change to our care minutes, and change to our RN minutes if these residents were to be reassessed today? So from there, that takes us to a high-level view of the changes resulting from that reassessment activity and what this means for both our care minutes and our average daily subsidy. So currently in this example, our care minutes are sitting at 192 minutes per resident per day, and average daily subsidy sitting at $254. So based on that work the clinical team have put into the system, we can see that our care minutes can increase all the way up to 198 minutes per resident per day, and up to $259 per resident per day. As Andrew said before, if we do have the staff to fill that, then there's no harm in moving towards that. On the other hand of the equation, we're looking at residents whose assessment will place them in a class with lower funding and lower care minute requirements. And we can see that if we were to put all those residents through today, we could significantly drop our care minute requirement of the residents in situ, as well as dropping our funding quite significantly. So this was the first step to understand that full AN-ACC profile alongside that full AN-ACC profile of all the residents we currently have in the facility today, Andrew.
Right, and I think that one really important point was when we started engaging with the site-based teams, and they all were quite varied. So some of them were older and some of them were younger and some of them were more experienced in aged care and some of them in the organization, some of them. So there was a lot of variation. So when we initially started with the implementation of the model and getting them together and explaining the information, first of all, the organization was fantastic. Everybody was just really, really keen to understand a new way and adopt a new way. There was no pushback at all. It was just really fantastic. But when it came to the actual system, everyone really lit up when it came to the system. Everybody wanted to understand how they were going to be able to use the system. And as soon as they got in to start seeing their own information, it really started to bring this sort of AN-ACC process and AN-ACC model to life. They were really starting to see now their own information and what it looked like, and start to engage with what we were talking about when we said it's about balance and it's about knowing what your forecast is. Now that they could see it, it was really brought to life. So what was next? How did they, once they sort of got the hang of it, got in, started looking around, started seeing the information, how did they really start? What were the things they started using first? What were the first things they really started to engage with and get the most out of when they started?
Yeah, first, Andrew, it was a question of, we've got all this information here. We've got where our residents can move to. We've got all of the charts and graphs that show off all of the facilities' key metrics. But then in the system, they wanted to know what's next. So what can we do with all this information? And then from there, we would take them into the scenario planner in Mirus Metrics. So within the scenario planner, and I'm sure some people may have seen this before, but with our new update to the planner, we've inputted those key metrics which we talked about earlier. So in the scenario planner now, we're looking at our daily roster hours and for AINs and ENs, and our daily RN hours. So as mentioned before, having that access to this data was critical for the teams to start modeling these future scenarios. In here, we can also enter our cost assumptions as well. So once we're in the scenario planner, it's again, what do we do now, Chris? And then they were asking, we can see where our current workforce stands relative to our current resident needs. So we can see that we're currently delivering 102.5% of total time and 101.53% of our RN time. The next question, which we had to put back to the provider, is what's your budgeted occupancy? Because yes, we might be delivering over our requirements, but are we at where we need to be for occupancy? In this scenario, we have 105 residents and the budgeted occupancy could be at 107. So using that information, this is where we would then bring in the admissions team into the process. So the admissions team would know who's coming in the short term, and then we can use that information to add those residents into the scenario to get that full picture of where we're sitting today. So adding Andrew in at a class 11 and Tyler in at a class 8, we can see this automatically updates where we're currently sitting. And on the graph on the right, we can still see that we're right in the middle of that 3 stars, delivering 100% of total time and 100% of RN time. So now that we have this information, we know we're at our budgeted occupancy, we can then move to that next process, which is looking at which residents have we gone through and identified could change in classification. So if we're to add one resident change from a class 8 to a class 13, you'll see that in the interim, we are not compliant to the current case mix of our resident targets based on those average roster hours. So from there, we might look at doing a smaller resident change, such as a class 6 to a class 8. And then now this results in we're still delivering compliance with that current resident cohort at 107% our budgeted occupancy. And the outputs now is a 1.5% increase in margin, $1.25 increase to our average, and $1.25 increase to our average daily subsidy. So as we were saying before, this is now the process which they'll go through on at least a fortnightly basis. And then as Tyler was talking about earlier, throughout the pay period to balance any of those new admissions and departures. This is just one example of how the AN-ACC funding team, the workforce team to get the hours in, and the admissions team to provide us with that new information would all collaborate within the one tool in the scenario planner. And then this is just one site, one example. It also became evident that some other sites throughout the process were overstaffing or understaffing. And this really came down to a few things, but the main one was there was no adjustment for occupancy. So the sites that were overstaffing were well below their budgeted occupancy, and vice versa for the sites that were understaffing. They were well above their budgeted occupancy. No changes had been made to residents to rectify that, and no budget changes had been made from management to also help that process as well, Andrew.
Yeah, excellent. So I guess then the last question is always, I remember we moved really quickly to get to a sort of operating level of understanding. The teams really embraced the new information, they embraced the new process, they embraced the new system, and within a short period of time, maybe 4 to 6, I mean, it took a little while to get the care minute and the rostering information, the supply side really clear, so we knew what they were looking at. But I remember that once we did that, then you started getting the value. Then you really started to see the value coming out of the process, because every site was a little bit different for varying reasons. One had been, recently decanted, and because of some changes, and so different reasons. Every site's in a slightly different. Some might be new. Every site's always in a different sort of part of its cycle, but it really shows the differences. But one of the things we really started to see then was where there was a mismatch. So the funding was high or low, but then the rosters were high or low, and then the agency percentage was high or low. And when, you know, when the funding was high and the rosters were low, and you could see the agency making up the difference, you could see what you needed to do about that, or what your choices were. When there was, you know, when you're over for care minutes and under for funding and over for agency, you could then start to make decisions about that. Why are you using those agency? Why are you contributing more agency to a roster that's already high against its funding, unless you're going to push up the funding? So it gave you the levers you needed in the information to make tactical, practical decisions at the site level independently, but still maintain this overview. But now that they've sort of started to adopt the system and they were getting used to it, and we'd run a number of fortnightly meetings and everyone's getting the hang of it, what were then some of the things that some of the more keen users, some of the people who adopted it more quickly, what were some of the things that they really started to get value from after that?
Yeah, Andrew. So to start, one of the main dashboards in the system, managers and executives are now looking at that on a regular basis. They can see daily changes to their subsidies, to their occupancy, just in that one spot, again, for all of the facilities or all of the facilities together, or individual facilities alone. And then with also in the system, if you just wanted to jump to the next slide. So this is that overview which exec have a view of. They can see down the bottom as well how many of our residents are being assessed, and then how often and how frequent are those assessments being completed. The facilities also now have access to the forecast accuracy, which Tyler was talking about earlier. This helps identify any possible gaps in the documentation, or is it highlighting a reason to get the AMO back out to site? So, for example, this resident was forecast a class 11, they came back as a class 7. If the clinical team said, no, this person's definitely still in the not mobile category, that's just a quick reconsideration to bring the AMO back out to site. So then bringing in the wider teams, the management, workforce and finance teams are utilising some of the out-of-the-box reporting within Mirus Metrics. So some of this is viewing all of those residents we've put through for reassessment and the change in subsidy, and then also monitoring further forward based on our current resident cohorts from the calculation period. What are our targets going to be in the following quarters? So there's quite a bit in there which they're using. And then outside of this, they're also requesting bespoke reporting and data upload. So they can take some of this data we've got in the system and present it in their own Power BI systems, which is all part of Mirus Metrics.
Yeah, that's great, Chris. Thanks for that. Yeah, definitely forecasting is a really great feature, and it should be noted that in our system, this is not taken from My Aged Care portal. This is calculated independently of it, so accurately that when the department in the last 12 months had an error on their forecasts, ours was accurate, and a great client of ours in WA picked up the error, came to us and told us that our system was wrong. We checked it, we were right. We went back to the department and said, we think your calculation is wrong, and we helped them fix their calculation in My Aged Care portal. So this is a completely independent calculation of your forecast, and very accurate. So thanks for that. Thanks for that, Chris. Thanks for all of that information. So the client is up and running. I'm very, very happy. They've got great teams. Their teams know what they're doing. We're providing them some ongoing light support. They've kept the system. The system really keeps everybody accountable. It also gives transparency of the information to what everybody's doing. But here are some other considerations that you'll have to think about next. These are the next pitfalls that you need to make sure you keep track of. Get rid of the spreadsheets in your process. Like Chris said, the system can export data into your Power BI if you want to maintain management reporting. This is not duplicating that. It's making sure that that information is the same. This is an application for users to use to manage the process. Wider stakeholder communication. So for the people not in the process, the ability to provide some of this information to other stakeholders so they can see what's going wrong. We haven't talked that much about finance, but they're obviously a big stakeholder. Risk and controls and accountability. How do you make sure that you have the right control steps at the right places? Obviously, managing the AMO process and the documentation and review of the documentation that's being used in that process. That's what we're working on with them next. How do you make sure you increase the accuracy? A new KPI can be the success that you have at each site in converting what you've forecasted to an accurate, and there's lots of variables to that. Could be the documentation, could be the variability of the AMOs, could be a training need on your site, but we're working with that. And then how do you maintain it? New staff induction. How do you maintain when new people come in? How do you get them to come up to speed and adopt what everybody else knows? So we're working with the team on that. So that's definitely what happens next. So just flick back to you, Tyler. Anything interesting come up in the chat that you wanted to mention?
We did have one question posed to everyone from Anthony regarding when we would see financial penalties for non-compliance. And so I did put a response in there where, there is the liability of a financial penalty already, but that is a last resort. And we had another question from Louise, who was posed it to me directly, and it reads, we are not meeting our care minutes and also in deficit. How do we solve both of these problems, which are at opposition? And that's a really challenging position to be in, of course. And there's, as we've spent the last hour describing, can take on quite a range of facets where you need to look at your rosters and how you're actually capturing those minutes. Are you sure you're getting all of the minutes counted? But there's other considerations that look at resident contribution. Are you at a deficit because your accommodation revenue isn't keeping pace or matching the expenditure on hotel services? And even billing integrity. We do a lot of work with financial teams that struggle with their monthly resident invoicing, doing that monthly reconciliation of Medicare claiming, and we're always finding revenue for these providers. They may have missed out on accommodation supplements or missed revenue somewhere. Services Australia is bound to make errors as well, and it's up to you to catch those. So a lot of considerations, and I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Andrew.
Well, we're all waiting for the task force report's going to give us the detail on what's going to happen with that, and that side of the non-care funding side. But that's going to be a critical part of how people make ends meet, especially since AN-ACC is designed to be narrow margins, and that's all of what we've been talking about in this session is about getting on top of your AN-ACC process, managing it the way it's supposed to be managed accurately in a timely way. You're leveraging the technology available to make sure that you maximize those margins. So we just wanted to finish off by saying, look, if you're in that 40-something%, or even if you're in the 56% and now are not so sure that you're managing as well as you could be, there are things that you can do. So Mirrors Metrics, we want to offer to everybody on this call. If you are interested in the system, please get us to give you a walkthrough of that. For anybody who was in this session, we'll give you 20% off the system for the first 12 months. And the other thing is our AN-ACC Accelerator. This exact process that we've gone through is the AN-ACC Accelerator. We'll take you from wherever you are to working perfectly well over a couple of months, and really engage with your staff and get you working the way that you need to be working. If you're somewhere in that process, if you think you've got most of those things working, think about the system. If you think you're not even getting those processes working yet, get the accelerator first. You'll get a chance to look at the system in the meantime, and all of that's discounted for you guys. Scan that code and get involved. This is something that can be fixed now. Don't be in the 50% after 2 years that still aren't managing that AN-ACC properly. And when they do squeeze and the compliance is coming and you will meet your care minutes and 215's around the corner, manage that accurately. There are providers, plenty of providers out there who are fully compliant and profitable. So we can help you get there if you're not there, and it's not as hard as it might seem. So please get in contact with us. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining us for this hour, and we will be happy to answer any other questions that anybody wants to pose to us after the call. If reach out and contact us, and we will be more than happy to help. Hope you've appreciated, enjoyed that. It's the best example of end-to-end implementation from a wrong process to a right process that we can give you. Hope you've enjoyed it. Thanks for joining, and have a great rest of the day.